The wind came in hard off the plains, carrying dust, anger, and the sound of a town about to tear itself apart. Before you sink into this story, do one small thing that helps keep these stories alive. Subscribe to our channel. Share this tale with your friends and ride with us into the raw heart of the Old West, where one decision could damn a man forever. They remembered the moment by the words shouted first, not the gunshot that followed. "Your head, don't." That was as far as he got. The rancher stood in the middle of Main Street, with his boots planted like roots, the sun burning down on the crown of his hat. His name was Caleb Harlan, a man known for quiet work, paid debts, and a temper he kept locked behind his ribs. Folks said he was slow to speak but slower to forgive. When his hand moved that day, it wasn't fast, it was certain. The man across from him, a deputy once, a drunk always, had a smile twisted into something ugly. He'd been laughing, leaning too close, saying things that shouldn't be said in daylight, things about Caleb's wife, things about her past, things about what he'd done and what no one had stopped him from doing. The warning came from somewhere behind Caleb, a woman's voice cracking, maybe the preacher's boy, maybe half the town at once. It didn't matter. The deputy's head snapped back when the butt of Caleb's revolver struck his temple with a sound like a split log. He went down hard, blood darkening the dust. Silence followed. Not peace, never peace, but a silence so tight it felt like it might choke the whole street. Then the town exploded. Men shouted. Women screamed. Someone yelled for the sheriff. Someone else yelled to hang him right there. Caleb didn't run. He didn't kneel. He stood over the man he'd struck and breathed like he'd just come back from deep water. They dragged the deputy away, alive but broken, and they dragged Caleb with him, hands tied, jaw set. By sundown, every window in town glowed with anger. By midnight, the word was clear. The rancher had crossed a line, and the town wanted blood to pay for it. Caleb sat alone in a cell that smelled of rust and old regret. He stared at the wall and remembered every step that had led him here. He remembered his wife, Anna, standing on the porch that morning, smoothing her dress, smiling like she always did when she didn't want him to worry. He remembered the way the deputy's eyes lingered on her when he rode past. He remembered the rumors that never died, the ones that followed Anna from another town, another life. He hadn't planned to strike him. That was the lie people told themselves to sleep. The truth was worse. Some part of him had been waiting. Outside, the town gathered. The sheriff tried to calm them, but his voice drowned under old grudges and new fear. If a rancher could strike a lawman and live, what did that mean for order? If they let this go, what would come next? They didn't see a man protecting his wife. They saw a threat to their fragile peace. As the moon climbed, Anna stood at the edge of the crowd, her shawl pulled tight. She heard the words thrown like stones: murderer, savage, animal. She knew the truth, but truth had no place in a mob. She thought of the deputy's hands, the way he'd cornered her months ago, the way he'd laughed when she threatened to tell. She'd stayed silent to protect Caleb. Now that silence might kill him. She stepped forward. Her voice was small at first, then stronger, slicing through the noise. She told them everything. She told them about the threats, the visits, the fear she'd carried alone. Some listened. Many didn't. Shame ran through the crowd like a bad current. Shame for what they'd allowed, and shame turns easily into rage. By dawn, the sheriff made his choice. Caleb would stand trial, but not here. He'd be moved before the town decided to become judge and executioner. They never got the chance. The rope came out just after sunrise. The second morning smelled like rain and reckoning. The crowd moved as one body, faces hard, eyes bright with the dangerous thrill of deciding another man's fate. Caleb was pulled from the cell, hands bound, boots scraping. He searched the faces until he found Anna. She stood straight, tears cutting clean lines through the dust on her cheeks. Their eyes met, and in that look lived a lifetime. Love, regret, and a promise neither could speak. The rope went over the beam of the old livery. Someone tied the knot too tight. Someone else prayed. Someone laughed. "Your head, don't." A voice tried again, maybe the same one, maybe another brave soul too late to matter. The sheriff raised his hand, sweat shining on his brow. This was not how law was supposed to work, and he knew it. But towns are fragile things, and fear makes cowards of good men. Before the order could be given, a gunshot cracked from the far end of the street. Then another. Riders thundered in, dust flying, rifles raised. They wore no badges, only the hard expressions of men who'd seen what mob justice really cost. At their head was an old rancher, gray-bearded, respected, the kind of man people listened to when he spoke. He shouted for them to stop. He told them the truth they didn't want to hear, that if they killed Caleb Harlan, they'd never wash the blood off their hands, that they'd be no better than the man who'd used his badge to terrorize a woman and dared a husband to swallow it. The deputy, bandaged and pale, was dragged into the street. He denied it at first, then broke when the old rancher named names, dates, places. The truth spilled out ugly and undeniable. The rope slipped from Caleb's neck. No cheers followed, no relief, only the heavy understanding that the town had nearly damned itself. Caleb was cut free, legs weak, heart pounding. He didn't thank them. He walked to Anna and held her like the world might end if he let go. Some people turned Ed away, unable to meet their eyes. Others stared, angry now for different reasons. Justice came slow after that. The deputy was stripped of his badge, then of his freedom. The sheriff resigned. The town changed, but not all at once, and not for the better in every way. Trust, once broken, doesn't mend clean. Caleb and Anna left before winter. They rode out at dawn, past fields and fences, past a place that had almost killed them both. Folks would tell the story for years, arguing about right and wrong, about violence and restraint. But those who were there remembered one thing clearly: the moment a quiet rancher stood in the dust, heard a warning, and chose to act, setting fire to a town's conscience and forcing it to face what it had become. The night did not forgive the town for what it almost did. Before the story continues, ride with us a little longer, subscribe to our channel, and share this story with your friends. These stories live only if they're carried forward, the way truth used to travel across the plains, mouth to mouth, heart to heart. Caleb Harlan woke before dawn with the taste of rope still in his mouth. Even free, even breathing, his body remembered the pressure, the way the world had narrowed to a single knot, and the sound of his own pulse. He lay beside Anna in a borrowed bed at the edge of town, staring at the low ceiling, listening to her breathe like it might disappear if he closed his eyes. Outside, the town was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Not peaceful, ashamed. Shame settles heavy, like fog, and it doesn't lift just because the sun comes up. By mid-morning, the truth had spread faster than any lie ever had. The deputy's name was spoken with curses now, his badge lying on the sheriff's desk like a dead thing. Men who had shouted loudest for the rope avoided each other's eyes. Women whispered behind doors, wondering how close they'd come to losing a neighbor, a husband, a son. Caleb walked Main Street with Anna at his side. Every step felt like crossing a battlefield after the shooting stopped. Some folks nodded stiffly. Some turned away. A few stared with open resentment, as if he'd robbed them of something they'd wanted very badly. Justice, when it comes late, makes enemies on all sides. The deputy was moved to a holding cell under guard. He screamed about lies and conspiracies until the old rancher, the one who had stopped the hanging, stood in front of him and told him to save his breath. There were witnesses now, too many, and worse than witnesses, there was a town desperate to believe it hadn't almost become a monster. But monsters don't die just because you name them. That afternoon, Caleb was summoned to the sheriff's office. The sheriff, former now resignation written in a shaking hand, looked smaller behind the desk. He told Caleb the charges were being reconsidered. Assault, yes. Intent to kill, maybe not. The law needed something to hold on to, some way to say it still mattered. Caleb listened, jaw tight. When the man finished, Caleb spoke quietly. He said he'd take whatever punishment the law decided. He said he wouldn't apologize for protecting his wife. Not to the town, not to God, not to anyone. The sheriff nodded, eyes wet. He understood too late. By evening the town gathered again, but this time without torches or rope. The old rancher spoke, voice rough, telling them they could either tear themselves apart or decide to be better than their worst moment. Some agreed, some didn't. The split was clean, like a bone broken down the middle. That night a rock came through the window of the room where Caleb and Anna stayed. No note, no face, just a message carved in glass and fear. "You are not forgiven." Anna picked up the rock and held it until her hand bled. Caleb wrapped it in cloth and threw it back into the dark. They decided then to leave, not because they were guilty, not because they were afraid, though fear rode close. They left because staying would mean living every day under the memory of a rope that had almost tightened, under the eyes of people who would never fully believe the truth. Before dawn they packed what little they'd brought. Horses waited restless. The sky was pale, uncertain. As they rode out, a few figures stood watching. One woman pressed a hand to her mouth. One man tipped his hat. Another spat in the dirt. Caleb didn't look back after that. The road west was long and empty, the kind of road where thoughts grow loud. Caleb replayed the moment again and again. The deputy's grin, the words, the way his hand had moved before his mind caught up. He wondered if he'd crossed a line he could never step back over. Anna rode beside him, steady. She had crossed her own lines long ago, surviving in silence, carrying shame that was never hers. Now, for the first time, the weight felt lighter even as the future stretched unknown. They found work on a spread far from the town that almost killed them. The owner was a woman with iron in her spine and no patience for gossip. She asked few questions. She paid fair. She watched how Caleb worked, how he treated his wife, and that was enough. But the past has a way of finding you. Weeks later, a rider arrived with news. The deputy had escaped custody during a transfer. 2 guards injured, 1 dead. He was heading west, wounded, desperate, and burning with a hatred sharpened by humiliation. Caleb felt the old tension coil inside him. This was not over. It had never been over. The night the deputy came, there was no warning, no shouted words, just the creak of leather and the whisper of boots. He burst into the cabin, gun raised, eyes wild, face twisted by pain and rage. Anna screamed. Caleb moved. The fight was short and brutal. No speeches, no mercy asked or given. When it ended, the deputy lay bleeding on the floor, his weapon kicked away, his power gone for good. This time Caleb did not strike in anger. He held the man down and waited for the ranch hands to for the law to catch up. He looked into the deputy's eyes and told him this was where it ended, not with a rope, not with lies, but with truth and consequence. The deputy wept then, not for what he'd done, but for what he'd lost. When they took him away, Caleb sat on the cabin steps until sunrise, shaking. Anna sat beside him, her hand in his, grounding him in the world he'd almost lost. News traveled back east. This time the story was different. A rancher who'd stood his ground, a town forced to face itself, a man who could have become a killer but chose restraint when it mattered most. Caleb and Anna stayed on the spread. They built a life measured not by what others said, but by what they did each day. Honest work, quiet evenings, a love hardened and tempered by fire. Sometimes, at night, Caleb still heard the words, "Your head, don't." He would wake, heart racing, and Anna would pull him back. And each morning he would rise, step into the sun, and prove again, to himself most of all, that one terrible moment did not get to define the rest of his life. And that is how the story ends in the Old West, not with cheers, not with clean justice, but with a man and a woman riding forward, carrying scars, carrying truth, and refusing to let a furious town decide who they were.